Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Aquarian Age podcast. It's Tuesday the 12th of January 2021 as I'm recording this. It's the new moon. I think in about 3 or 4 hours time the moon will conjunct the sun at around 23 degrees of Capricorn and also conjunct transiting Pluto. So a very intense new moon. Also of note is the little party going on in the early degrees of Aquarius. We have Jupiter conjunct Mercury at around 5 degrees, which is also conjunct my north node, my natal north node. And we also have Saturn nearby, forming a close conjunction with them as well. And all of that is squaring to Mars and Uranus in Taurus. And we also have Venus trine Uranus as well. Now I think those are the prominent astrological aspects at the moment, and every time I record this podcast I'm going to give the aspects at the time, because I think that's important to gain an understanding of the cosmic play of things, I guess you could call it. A lot of Uranus energy in the current new moon, and how is that playing out for me? Well, I had no idea, I had no plans at all to be doing a podcast. That has literally come out of the blue. So for me, the new moon and the Uranus element to it has brought this podcast. It also has brought a lot of difficult energies for me personally with the Pluto conjunction. I've really kind of been feeling that yesterday. I wasn't sure what was going on. Thought, gosh, despair was taking over me, and I was getting a lot of anger and difficult energies, and then it's like, oh yeah, God, it's the conjunction. It's the new moon conjunct Pluto. So I been spending a lot of time with black tourmaline in my hand to kind of ward off those energies. Anyhow, my name is Sunny. I'm the host, and yes, I am an Aquarius. My natal sun is in Aquarius, conjunct my north node, in fact. But this is not going to be a podcast just about astrology, okay? And in this first episode, I really want to take the time to explain what the podcast is going to be about, why it's called the Aquarian Age, and then also give a little bit of information about me. Now, I am reading from a script, okay? I first want to start by talking about why I've called this the Aquarian Age, and for this part I've written a script because I wanted to be really precise, okay? For the rest of it, I've just got some brief notes and I'm going to talk a bit more freely. But for explaining about why I've called this the Aquarian Age, I'm going to be reading from a script. So if it sounds a bit wooden, my apologies. And if the recording's a bit dodgy and there are all kinds of little noises going on and so forth, then again, you'll just have to accept that. It's going to take me a while to get used to this. As I said, I had no intention of doing this. Really, it just came in the bath this morning. Having a big hot bath for an hour as a kind of cleansing ritual, and it just opened up and it was clear what I was going to talk about and what the whole thing was going to be about. So let me start then by talking about why I have called this the Aquarian Age. So Aquarius is a zodiac sign, okay? That's a region of the celestial sphere known as the ecliptic, to which the sun travels each year. It's also a constellation. Aquarius is also a constellation, okay? And that's something which is very separate to a zodiac sign. That is not often clear to a lot of people, including astrologers. The person who taught me astrology did not know this. It's a really important kind of distinction to make. So a constellation, everybody's familiar with a constellation. It's a recognized group of stars in the sky, like Orion in winter, or the Great Bear, which includes the Plough whereas a zodiac sign is just a region of the ecliptic, and that's just the path that the sun traces out through the celestial sphere. So our zodiac signs got their name from Ptolemy, who lived approximately a couple of thousand years ago, and he named the signs of the zodiac, and he named them after the constellations in which they happened to be in at the time. Now, even though the zodiac signs are no longer predominantly in those constellations anymore, and have shifted by about 23 degrees, the astrologers, modern day astrologers, still attribute the qualities of those constellations onto those zodiac signs and maintain the Ptolemaic names. Now, there's a good reason for that, okay? Every 2,500 years, related to the precession of the equinoxes, what's known as the precession of the equinoxes, which basically means that every 2,500 years, the vernal equinox, what we can think of as the timing of spring, when things start to shoot in the northern hemisphere, all the shoots from the plants start to come up. Every 2,500 years, that shifts into a new zodiacal sign. Now, if I roughly translate that into meaningful language, what that means is that as the millennia go by, the constellations that we see in the sky when spring comes will change. Okay, they change, they move. And when they change by a whole sign, then according to astrology, a new astrological age is ushered in. And that means that the signs of the zodiac for the next 2,500 years will change. They'll develop new attributes and shed old attributes, which reflect the new background constellations that they happen to be in. So it's a bit like the leaves on a tree. If you think annually a tree sheds its leaves every year, so too the zodiacal signs shed their attributes and they develop new attributes, which are a reflection of the new background constellations that they happen to be in. When Ptolemy named the zodiac signs after the constellations they were in at the time, of course he was essentially designating the attributes of the zodiac signs for the zodiacal age of Pisces. So today we are currently transitioning into the zodiacal age of Aquarius. I say we're transitioning because there's no fixed moment in time where we can say, now we're in the age of Aquarius. And the reason for that is there's no clear boundary between the constellations of Aquarius and Pisces. If you look up at the night sky and you make out Aquarius and Pisces, which are both very faint constellations, you won't be able to see them in a city where there's a lot of light pollution. But if you look up at them, you'll see there's no clear boundary between them. Okay. On star maps, there's a clear boundary between them that astronomers have laid down, but it's a very artificial boundary. It's like the boundary that the European colonists drew on maps of Africa and said, this is Zimbabwe and this is so on and so forth. So very artificial kind of boundaries, and not one that you can really use to define when the age of Aquarius begins. So the reality is that the age of Aquarius is a process that's happening. It's a transition that's happening now, and that will take place over centuries. It's not going to happen in the next 10 years. It's going to happen over centuries. Maybe the next 500 years, maybe in 500 years' time we'll be able to say, now the spring equinox is clearly in Aquarius, but until then we're in a transitional period. So why the age of Aquarius then? Well, what's significant now is that in December of 2020 we had the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at the ingress of Aquarius. Okay. Now, I heard some people suggest that this is a herald for the age of Aquarius, for the beginning of the age of Aquarius. But for me, no, I don't think so. Yes, Saturn is the traditional kind of Hellenistic ruler of Aquarius. So Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the ingress of Aquarius, yes, could be a good contender for an astrological herald of the age of Aquarius, but what to me is missing is any aspect to Mercury. If it's going to be a herald, well, that's Mercury's job, and there's no aspect to Mercury in that. So I don't think it's heralding the age of Aquarius. I think for that, you'd want Uranus to be involved as well, and you'd want Mercury to be involved as well. So you might be looking at, for example, a grand trine involving those 4 planets or something like that. So to me, we are still firmly in the end days of the age of Pisces. I think our culture has a lot of death and destruction yet to play out, and I think that the age of Aquarius over the next few centuries will emerge from the ashes of our current culture, which seems to have committed itself to its own destruction. However, I cannot ignore the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that occurred at the ingress of Aquarius. To me, that's hugely significant. Now, I've been practicing yoga for 15 years, and these podcasts are going to primarily be about yoga. And in yoga and the development of yogic consciousness, Jupiter is critical. You know, if we think in sort of Hellenistic astrology, we think of Jupiter as the benefic planet that helps everyone. You know, that's the seed of yoga. That's the seed that of that brings the consciousness that is yoga. So to me, this conjunction is a key conjunction for the ripening of yogic consciousness across the earth today. And I believe that ripening will play a key role over the coming centuries in ushering in the new age of Aquarius. Now, the Saturnian element. Why a Saturnian element? Well, I just think that's going to bring a very strong protective element that is going to protect the development of that yogic Jupiterian consciousness. When you meditate in yoga and you develop a protective energy through that meditation, you're essentially channeling a benefic Saturnian energy. So the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction tells me that those people who have been seeded with yogic consciousness, whose yogic consciousness is now going to develop post the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions of 2020, it's going to come with a very protective Saturnian energy, which will come through, which those individuals will experience in their meditation. Now, my sun sign is Aquarius. I actually have the sun in my natal chart. I have the sun conjunct my north node, and in opposition to that I have the moon conjunct the south node. I also have Sagittarius. My ascendant is in Sagittarius, and my natal Jupiter is conjunct the galactic center in Sagittarius. So a lot of Sagittarius, Jupiterian yogic energy, and that's significant. And of course the galactic center is the sort of cosmic kind of energy. So to me, that's as close as you can get, in my view, to an astrological sign for a potential teacher of yoga. In other words, if you wanted to see what does a potential teacher of yoga look like in their natal chart, well, I think that would be a pretty key example of what you might look for. You'd want Sagittarius on the ascendant, Jupiter in the first house conjunct the cosmic galactic center, and yeah, the sun conjunct north node in Aquarius gives that an Aquarian kind of Aquarian flavour to it, you know. So I guess those are the kind of astrological kind of indications of my own kind of I don't know what you'd call it, like qualifications for teaching yoga and yoga related to the age of Aquarius, you know. But in addition to that, in 2008, transiting Jupiter and Pluto conjuncted the galactic center and my natal Jupiter, and that began for me a really ground-breaking, ground-transforming, earth-shattering kind of process of transformation, a yogic transformation that ended with the last Pluto-Jupiter conjunction of 2020. I say it ended, really, I mean one phase of it ended and a new phase has begun, okay? And that new phase that has begun is this. I believe it's now time for me to teach yoga to those who, after the multiple kind of transformative Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn conjunctions and squares to Mars that occurred throughout 2020, now have been seeded, and their yogic consciousness is going to unfold this year. I believe that consciousness is going to be critical for the unfolding of the age of Aquarius. and that's why I've named this podcast The Aquarian Age. It's going to act as a calling card, I think, for those who are ready. It's what will draw you to this podcast. It's what the astral energies will have primed your minds to be drawn to. So that's why I've called this the Aquarian Age. Now I want to talk about what kind of topics I'm going to cover. Okay, so I've talked about why I've called this the Age of Aquarius, this podcast the Age of Aquarius, and now I'm going to talk about the topics that I'd like to cover, and then I'm going to finish off with a little bit about myself. So the kind of topics that I'm going to cover on this podcast, I guess you might shepherd them all under the banner of occult philosophy, as long as you understand philosophy as a way of life, in the sense of yoga is a way of life. So we could call it yogic philosophy, but that's perhaps a little bit esoteric in the sense of, maybe esoteric isn't the right word, but it's perhaps a little bit alien to people. People don't really know what yoga is, but they have some sense of the occult. But the danger of using the word occult is it sounds malefic, it sounds scary. It's like Pluto, like the Pluto kind of Sun-Moon conjunction. There's a scary conjunction, and the word occult has that kind of dangerous element to it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because any time you're dealing with occult matters, whether it's astrology or yoga, yes, there is great danger. So we could call these topics, we could put them under the banner of occult philosophy or yogic philosophy, as long as you understand philosophy as a way of life. Okay, so I'll be talking about meditation. That's really what distinguishes yoga from all other forms of spiritual practice. Yoga is the only form of spiritual practice that I know of that includes meditation. Okay, the really archetypal symbol of yoga is a figure seated in meditation, and the earliest examples of those were about 3500 BC along the Indus Sarasvati civilization in modern day Pakistan. Now I mentioned Saturn and Saturn's relation to meditation. In other words, the transits of Saturn bear relation to the types of energy that you can channel when you meditate. Now, because we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, because we had the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction at the end of 2020, I believe that meditation, and a very strong protective meditation, is going to be unfolding for those people who have been seeded with yogic consciousness, whose yogic consciousness is going to begin unfolding. So the topic of meditation and understanding the role of Saturn, the energies that can come through Saturn in that meditation, are going to be important. I'll also be talking about astrology, how to utilize astrology to protect your yogic consciousness, how looking at the Saturn transits can show you how your meditation is going to unfold in stages in terms of strength and ability and depth of meditation. How long can you stay in a state of meditation with your mind clear, and how strong how strong is that kind of river of energy that you can channel. That's something that will unfold in stages, and you can look to the Saturnian transits and the aspects to the other planets and to your natal chart to see that. So I'll be talking about that. Ceres is another body that's really critical in yoga. CERES, Ceres. I think it's classified as a minor planet, but it's traditionally was a large asteroid. That's really key to realizations, to what we call yogic realizations. On the path of yoga, one is attempting to realize the truth, the development of direct seeing. You're trying to realize a yogic power, and that is done in stages. And in my experience of yoga and astrology, Ceres is really critical in harvesting those realizations and bringing them to fruition. And of course, there are other aspects such as Jupiter and Mercury, which can bring teaching, yogic teachings. So astrology will be a really important topic that I will cover in the podcast. Activism too, not traditionally associated with yoga, but remember we're talking about also about the age of Aquarius, and activism, that sense of cooperation, that sense of non-hierarchy, and everyone in it together and coming together is key to the kind of spirit of Aquarius. And there are some really important elements to activism. Often people think of activism as trying to achieve a revolution. When they say, for example, well, what's the point of activism? All of that stuff, all that activism in the 60s didn't achieve a revolution, therefore it's a failure, which is really a very sort of poor understanding of activism, because what activism really is about, where its power really lies, is in cultural transformation and really creating transformative spaces. When you view the 60s that way, wow, the 60s created a cultural revolution that reverberates to this day. It was powerful. And those transformative spaces that activism can create are important in developing yogic consciousness. They really are. So it's really important to be involved in those. And those transformative spaces really, I guess, a lot of people might think, activism, I'll go and enjoy my local litter picking group, or I'll go and volunteer at my Oxfam shop. But those are not transformative spaces, okay? So when we're talking about transformative, they're not transformative spaces because they mirror the structures in the society you're in. So you're not going to get any transformation there. In order to get a transformative space, you've got to enter a space where the structures of society no longer exist. And for that, you really need to be involved in grassroots movements. So when I talk about activism, I'm talking about grassroots movements. They're generally decentralized. They operate by consensus. You got people from a range of social and ethnic backgrounds. So it's a real kind of transformative space. And of course, Age of Aquarius is all about a utopian kind of society, or cooperative, non-egalitarian kind of non-hierarchical society, with a benefic relationship with the earth. And you cannot achieve that unless you have people who are actively engaged in their societies and who will get together to oppose power and corruption wherever it occurs. Okay, so and of course other elements of activism include inner work. If you're involved in activism, you have to do your inner work. You have to overcome your sexism, you have to overcome your racism, you have to overcome your class prejudices, you have to overcome your kind of tendency to dominate the earth, with the resources and everything else. And so you have to do a lot of inner work, and there's also a lot of trauma and healing from trauma and so on and so forth. So all of that is going to be covered in these podcasts as well. Crystals. Crystals, their use in yoga, theories of their occult properties. How do crystals work? A lot of people think it's just kind of mumbo jumbo. Crystals are nothing. If you bring a physical detector to try to detect the energies of crystals, you won't detect anything, because these energies that crystals channeled are subtle energies. They're like the astral rays that the celestial bodies emanate. They're subtle. They're not physical energies like magnetism or gravity. And they connect you to other minds, to occult powers, to other minds. So they'll need to do some podcasts explaining really the occult philosophy of crystals, how you can use them in yoga, how you can use them to protect yourself for psychic self-defense, how to protect yourself against malefic astral energies, like we have at the moment with the moon conjunct the sun, conjunct Pluto. That's a dangerous transit. And it's certainly a transit where you're going to need to use crystals really to protect yourself. Ethics is really central to yoga. It's something that's often overlooked, but it's not obvious. If you ask people about ethics, they'd say, it's just about being nice to people. No, that's not ethics. Ethics involves a really detailed analysis. Is owning property ethical? Is flying ethical? Is it ethical for me to wear a woolen jumper? These are difficult ethics, and we might think that they're largely irrelevant, but in yoga they're not. They're really critical. Also, ethics includes energies, emotional energies like anger or hatred. Is it okay to express anger or hatred? You know, a lot of astrologers or personal development people still teach that anger is healthy, it's normal, everybody experiences it, you don't want to bottle it up, you've got to express it. In yoga, it's very different. Anger is a toxic, destructive energy that you really need to cage. You don't want to be expressing it. It may be normal in the sense that everybody expresses it, but then so is sexism, so is racism, you know, so is war. Lots of things are normal. That doesn't make them healthy. And similar for hatred. So ethics will also involve understanding our emotions and what energies we channel into the world. Love. People often think yoga is about love, and if you look at, for example, the Christian canon or the Christian sort of iconography, or the iconography of Hinduism, you'll often see sort of doughy-eyed beings, like sort of Bambis, you know, all kind of loving, and people often think yoga is that. It's like, okay, well, I often thought that developing a yogic consciousness means I'm going to become that. That's not the case, and that's not really what love is. Love really is a responsibility that you exercise towards others, yourself and others and all life forms. It's not a subjective feeling state as it is depicted in religious iconography. Okay, it is a state, but it's not that kind of doughy-eyed Bambi kind of lovey-dovey, fluffy kind of thing. It's much more mature and adult. It's much more adult. That's a very kind of immature understanding of love, I think. So ethics is important, and addictions. Okay, ethics also include understanding our addictions, which include things like sugar or driving to fossil fuel and driving and so on and so forth. Also be looking at Shakti and the Kundalini, these kind of feminine bodily energies, what they are, their central importance in yoga, how you can transform them, their depiction in the sort of yogic Buddhist iconography as goddesses, and where you can connect to sources of Shakti. For example, I go swimming every day in a local lake, pretty much every day. Gets harder over the winter. A few days ago I went in where the ice was covering the surface. I had to break the ice to get in. That was hard. It was very cold. But I go in, I do that because I connect to a feminine Shakti that purifies me. It's a spirit that lives in that lake and it purifies me. So I'll be talking more about how you can connect to sources of Shakti and the dangers of doing that. You know, a lot of people in the New Age movement often connect to trees, but to me that's a very dangerous approach, because you are connecting to something you don't know anything about, you know. And yes, the essential importance of these feminine energies in yoga. Well, if you think of yoga and the yogic consciousness as a flower, then the plant, obviously in order to generate that flower, you need a plant. You need a seed. The seed was planted during the Jupiter Saturn conjunction, and then that seed needs to come to fruition. It develops leaves and so on and so forth. All of that physical body of the plant that generates and carries the flower to fruition, that's the Shakti. Okay, this is the feminine energies, so they're really absolutely vital in yoga, and understanding them is really vital. So we'll be spending some time talking about Shakti and the Kundalini energies. Also be looking at depth psychology. I guess mostly when we talk about depth psychology, we're talking about Jung. That's most people's familiarization, and depth psychology generally talks about the understanding of psychology down to the archetypal level. But also I like to introduce some Freud. I think Freud's got some useful concepts such as the id. I think the id is useful in understanding some Shakti energies. I think the superego, which is a Freudian concept, is a really useful idea for understanding how occult powers can control not just individuals but whole populations of people through this thing that Freud called a superego. And of course I want to talk about dreams. The sort of typical Jungian approach to dreams is, well, dreams are a communication from the unconscious, and therefore they're telling you something about the unconscious. But that kind of, I guess I would call that an ideology, because it's kind of a fixed view of dreams as coming from the unconscious, and the unconscious somehow representing the self. But with that kind of understanding of dreams, I think you're leaving yourself really exposed to trickster energies. You know, you can get all kinds of dreams, can come from all kinds of sources, you know, and you have to be really very discerning about your dream content. I discard a lot of dreams, and in yoga generally dreams are not considered a great source of benefic wisdom, but they certainly can be, and I certainly pay attention to them. But I've certainly heard many Jungians give really bad interpretations of dreams, where it was clear to me that they were malefic in origin, and not from the self. And so, yes, talking a lot about depth psychology, so that we can understand the archetypes, the relationship to archetypes and astrology, and models of the unconscious. And there's this field called transpersonal psychology. So somebody like Ken Wilber, who wrote the Atman Project, I think he's introduced. It's a difficult read. Doesn't need to be, but it is a difficult read. But I think he's introduced some really useful concepts that are worth also exploring. And then finally, last but not least, of course, there is going to be a lot of podcasts on yogic teachings. So in yoga, the final goal of yoga is to develop what's known as the power of direct seeing. So I'll talk a bit about what that is and what it involves, and also the fact that this is not a personal decision that you can make. You cannot just say, I'm going to become a yogi, and I'm going to meditate. No, you can't, because yoga is something, and the yogic consciousness is something that unfolds. It's a cosmic energy, and that's why I keep saying that the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction and the 3 Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions of 2020, but culminating in that final Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, have seeded people out there. I don't know how many, but it's seeded people out there with this yogic consciousness that is going to begin unfolding. Of course, you have a choice. You can decide not to go with it, but I mean, I think for most people, I would think it's unlikely that many people are not going to allow this to unfold and go with it. And a lot of those people who have been seeded won't know. I didn't know. In 2008, when I was seeded with this consciousness and it began to spring forth, it wasn't until 4 or 5 years afterwards that I really knew. It's like, I understand what's happening to me now. So and possibly this podcast will be the first time that people will start to get intimation that, is that me? Am I going to have a yogic consciousness that's going to begin unfolding? Well, that will certainly be unclear in time anyway, if it is. So how does the yogic power of direct seeing unfold? I'll be talking about that. We'll be looking at Buddhist and Hindu scriptures like the Buddhist Heart Sutra, which contains the argument of dependent arising, which really deconstructs reality. And we can see the same argument in the older Chandogya Upanishad of Hindu scripture. And these are really critical philosophical doctrines in yoga that traditionally are what the yogic consciousness relies upon to unfold. So they're critical, but in the West there are many obstacles within the mind that need to be removed before that can happen. So we'll also be talking about modern science, physics, mind psychology, neurology and depth psychology, in order to remove those obstacles to pave the way for the more ancient teachings on which the final realizations will ride on the back of. And I should say, for those of you who have a strong Jungian bent, yoga and the unfolding of yogic consciousness is not individuation. Okay, individuation is something else. So this is not individuation. So that's a kind of overview of the kind of topics that I'm going to be talking about. A really kind of wide-ranging view of topics, all of which are essential to get to grips with in order to assist your yogic consciousness in unfolding, and also in giving you, the personality experiencing it, the chance to understand what's happening. If you don't understand what's happening, it can be terrifying and it can destroy the whole thing. So understanding what's happening is really critical. So I talked about why this is called the Aquarian Podcast and who it's designed to attract. I talked a bit about the topics that I'm going to be talking about, and now I want to talk, just to give a little bio about me, because if this yogic consciousness is unfolding in you, then I'm going to be essentially taking an archetypal role as a teacher in your life, and it's important, I think, to know something about that person, because it's quite an intimate experience, so it's important to know a bit about that person and what they've been through. I talked a bit about my astrological qualifications, that if you're an astrologer you can think, okay, well that's good, but if you're not an astrologer, then just talking a little bit about me and my background and how things have worked out for me in yoga and everything is going to help, I think. So I'm going to start at age 20, because at age 20 up to the age of 20 I'd spent about a quarter of my life locked up in secure care homes or juvenile detention centres or prisons, which is a shocking statistic, a shocking amount of time. It's not a statistic, it's a shocking amount of time. It was a brutal experience, and it points to a very, I mentioned that right at the start because you can clearly see, wow, that points to a really troubled childhood. Okay, one of my earliest memories of my childhood is being in hospital, having my head stitched up after my father had smashed my head against the plate. And I still had that scar on my head. I had a very dangerously psychotic mother who terrorised me, was violent towards me, and was sexually abusive up until the age of when I started to enter puberty. So a very difficult childhood. Both my parents were immigrants. My father was from the Himalayas. He's a tribal Pashtun, which is a tribe of people who live in the Himalayan region of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and north western India. And my mother is Irish. So, and I was born onto a sort of born and brought up on a white working class estate in England, North London. So I experienced a lot of racism growing up as well. I mean, I can remember people coming out of their houses and throwing eggs at me and telling me to F off and go home. I can remember gangs running after me. It's a dangerous place for me. So a very difficult childhood, and of course I had extreme difficulties as a teenager that were acted out and caused me to spend a lot of time in secure, what you can call secure care. That's a bit of a kind of oxymoron to me because my experience wasn't one of being cared for, but that's what they call it. So that was my life up till about age 20. I'm going to switch now to age 48, which is my current age. I currently live in Manchester in the United Kingdom. I live in a council flat, which is sort of government housing. If you're not from England, that's government kind of run housing. It's in a very kind of poor inner city area of Manchester. Opposite my window is a wasteland, which is a dumping ground for all kinds of rubbish. And I've moved here, or I got housed here after a period of homelessness, which lasted quite a few years. I lived on an abandoned boat for about 3 years. I sofa surfed for about a year. And I lived in homeless hostels in Manchester for about a year. So I wasn't actually street homeless. But and then eventually I got housed here in Gorton in Manchester. So in between 20 and where I am now, of course, I had what ostensibly could be considered a normal life. I managed to get funding. I wanted to learn. I wanted to study when I got out of prison at 19, nearly 20. And I had a good social worker who managed to get me funding for 3 years, and I got good grades. I got top grades doing that, and I eventually went to university, and then I went on to do my doctorate in mathematics at Aberdeen University. My dream, I guess, was to study theoretical physics, but I guess I ended up in a very obscure area. I was sort of studying the existence of a very obscure kind of symmetry in various classes of space-time and general relativity, and maybe half a dozen people around the world were involved in that area of activity, so there was almost no chance of getting funding to carry on. So I wasn't able to carry on, and so I ended up going into teaching in secondary schools for about 6-7 years. That carried on until 2008. Up from about 2005 to 2008, I was still teaching, but I'd become heavily involved in activism, really concerned about climate change and the ecological kind of holocaust that's going on, and also about world poverty. So my real kind of passion started to switch to activism, and by 2008 that came to a head, and I decided I'm going to quit school and devote myself full time to my activism, which had really blossomed at that time. Of course, I can look back now, I can see that coincided with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction of 2008, which was also conjunct the galactic centre, which was conjunct my natal Jupiter. So I can see that really that was the beginning proper of my yogic transformation, which has culminated with the final kind of conjunction of 2020, which was the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction. I say culminated, not in the sense that it's over, but just in the sense that it's reached a new phase now, a teaching phase. So that's a little bit about my kind of background, I guess. I have a website that I've been putting up. It's a personal website. That I started it just by putting my photography on there, as I'm an amateur photographer. Then I started putting some of my collages on there. Again, I'm not a professional artist, just a very amateur kind of artist. And eventually I started putting my writings on yoga on there. So that website is www.aquarian-age.co.uk. I think it would have interest if you want to learn more about yoga. Then I would go to the section on yoga and read the essays contained there. And I've also written a book, but it's at present there are only 2 copies, so it's not one that anyone can buy. But it is a book called The Nature of Things. It's available for free on the website under the section called The Nature of Things. And it's really an essential book for the unfolding of yogic consciousness and for the development of what's called direct seeing, which is the perception of truth, which is the ultimate aim of yoga. It's this being able to perceive reality directly as it is. I guess I should kind of explain the period of homelessness that has occurred. I guess from sort of I quit school in 2008, quit teaching in schools in 2008, and I began activism full time. But around 2011 I stopped, and I just felt it had come to a natural end, and in the winter solstice of that year I had a really key vision which showed me that my yogic consciousness was coming to fruition and that I needed to focus now on spiritual path. So from 2012 till now I was purely focused on the spiritual path, and I'd been on what I'd call a satyagraha, which is a term that Gandhi coined, which is a kind of protest of where you do not cooperate with malefic institutions and powers. And I guess I had been on that since 2008. Partly the reason why I decided to quit teaching. I guess if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, there's this moment in Lord of the Rings when Gandalf is on a bridge over a chasm and he's fighting this Balrog demon, and he says, you shall not pass, you shall not pass. And then there's a tussle, and basically the demon drags Gandalf down into the underworld. And I guess that 2012 to 2020 period was that for me. I kind of was dragged down into the underworld to deal with these really difficult energies from my childhood. And that led me into homelessness and all kinds of other places, which now I'm still embroiled in. I'm still in this is not where I want to live. I'm still poor and I'm still having difficulties, but my yoga is doing fine. My yogic consciousness is doing fine, and it's coming on to new levels, and now it's starting to blossom a little bit, So that's where I am at personally. So that's the end of this first episode. I've covered why I've called this the podcast The Aquarian Age. I've spoken a bit about what topics I'm going to cover, and I've given you a brief bio about me so you can know a bit more about me. And that's it for the first episode. I'm not sure when and how often these podcasts are going to be produced. I'm guessing, like today, there's going to be a strong kind of Uranian element of unpredictability, but I expect it's going to be at least a month, and probably once a week, and possibly a bit more, because there's a lot of content to get through, and when your yogic consciousness starts to develop, it really it can just go quite fast. So stay safe, and I'll be back to speak to you all soon.